now started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our session on equitable and resilient urban sanitation services, framing an agenda for action. This morning, we would like to introduce the session and the speakers. First, I'd like to introduce myself as the moderator of the session. I'm Ann Thomas, the Senior Advisor on Sanitation and Hygiene at UNICEF New York. This morning, we have a distinguished panel that will be offering us some reflections and thoughts on urban resilient, climate resistant, resilient sanitation. I'd like to especially introduce the Honorable Minister of State on Climate Change in Pakistan, Ms. Sartaj Gul, the Joint Secretary, the Ministry of Water Supply in Nepal, Sunil Kumar Das Sir. And good morning. And we have the engineer, Salim from Tanzania, who will be reflecting later in the session on some of their experiences in country. But first, we will have a panel of experts who will offer some perspectives on urban sanitation from a few different perspectives. But before we jump into that, I'd like to just mention that this session is being co-sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Global Green Growth Institute, UNICEF, UN Habitat, the University of Technology, Sydney, and the World Bank Group. The speakers for this session have been carefully selected and comprise of senior level government officials, researchers, technocrats, and policymakers. Before we move further and really kick things off, I'd like to just walk you through a few housekeeping issues this morning. First, we are offering simultaneous translation in Spanish and French. And for the full details, you can refer to the chat function in Pathable, which will give you all the details for accessing the translation service. To keep it would be good for you to keep the Pathable session visible throughout, because we will be using the chat function in Pathable and not in Zoom. So if you'd like to engage in the discussion and ask a question to our panelists, which you will have the opportunity to do during the session, please refer to the Pathable chat session. You will be muted throughout the session, so please use the Pathable function for chat function. Finally, I'd just like to mention that because the time is tight in this session and we are quite limited, you will periodically hear my colleague, Mr. B.C. Agbarami, a WASH specialist with the UNICEF New York team, coming in just to help usher along the timekeeping for our panelists. Finally, I think the last thing I would like to mention now, before we go in, is just a brief overview of the session. We are going to be setting the scene, as I mentioned, with a few presentations from sector specialists on climate resilient sanitation, and this will be followed by our high-level panel. I'd like to ask you all now to go to the Pathable chat box and please introduce yourself. Let us know what your designation is, who you're representing, and this will be a chance for others to know who's on the call and perhaps to connect on particular issues of interest. And with that, I'd like to kick off this session by introducing our first speaker, Mr. Brian Arbogast, Director, Water, Sanitation and Hygiene of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to present the welcoming remarks. So Brian, I'd like to pass over to you for the initial remarks.
Thank you, Anne, and hello to everyone. I'm honored to have this opportunity to further welcome you all and to provide some opening remarks to set the context for the rest of this session. You know, at the best of times, scaling up the reach of safe, sustainable sanitation services within developing cities is really hard. Even back when the SDG 6 goals were first being discussed, we knew that they would be amongst the hardest to achieve, especially in cities that were already experiencing the fastest growth, with slums and informal settlements expanding faster than services could even be planned for. But as global atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases continue to rise, Urban areas are now seeing, growing impacts of climate change that exacerbate all of these challenges. And the poorest and the least served communities are expected to be the hardest hit. So today's session is about how we might meet these challenges and deliver truly equitable and resilient sanitation solutions. Now, in terms of equity, you'll hear references, for instance, to citywide inclusive sanitation, or CWISE. CWISE embodies a framework and a set of principles for ensuring that services reach everyone in the city. And as they are being embraced by more and more actors in the sector, I expect this won't be the only session this week where you will hear this term. But CWISE also provides a framework for thinking about the sustainability and the resilience of service delivery. So resilience being, of course, our second focus. And when it comes to climate resilience, by the end of this session, it should be very clear that every city leader or planner who is concerned about climate resilience needs to be thinking hard about sanitation. That sanitation, resilient sanitation systems are frankly essential to having resilient cities. So in this session, you'll hear how there's a wide variance in the resilience of various sanitation systems to different shocks that we can expect will become only more frequent in the future. So to give just 3 examples of climate-driven scenarios that raise challenges for today's sanitation systems, those might include areas where there will be an increase in degree or in frequency of flooding, whether that's due to heavier storms or a rise in sea level or storm surges, changes in rates of snow melt or rainfall. So that's one. Another one might be the increase in the degree or frequency of water shortages, again, whether due to drought or changes in rainfall patterns or even increasing competition among uses. And a third scenario might be the increase in the degree of migration into cities, whether that's driven by natural shocks like floods and droughts or man-made shocks like conflicts. So you'll also hear during the session that there is wide variance in greenhouse gas emissions that arise from sanitation solutions, especially those which produce a lot of methane and nitrous oxide. So for both these reasons, you'll hear why it's critically important that sanitation be included in all discussions of climate resiliency. So in all nationally determined commitments, NDCs, all national adaptation plans, NAPs, and in any equivalents that are done at subnational levels, including for individual cities. And you're going to learn from people who have really pioneered such efforts to date. Finally, in a world where funders are increasingly focusing their resources on projects that deliver climate co-benefits, whether that's in terms of mitigation or adaptation, I expect this session will really increase your knowledge and your understanding of the institutional frameworks, the policy requirements, the innovative financing approaches that can lead to more climate resilient urban sanitation solutions. So we've got an amazing group of experts. I'm really looking forward to a great conversation. I hope you'll all join us with some great questions of your own. So thank you again, welcome, and back to you, Anne.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was a great intro to our session this morning. As Brian mentioned, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers this morning. In our initial round, we'll have 3 experts who give different perspectives on climate resilient sanitation, and I'd like to introduce them all. And what we'll do is have each of them speak and hand off to each other. So we'll take the questions and answers following all 3 presentations. So I'd like to introduce them all. First, we'll have a presentation on climate resilient urban sanitation in Indonesia from evidence on climate hazards and impacts to action, which will be given by Ms. Freya Mills from the University of Technology, Sydney, and Ms. Marita Listiasari, a WASH specialist with UNICEF Indonesia. This will then be followed by a presentation on citywide inclusive sanitation and green, resilient, and inclusive development given by Martin Gambrill, the lead water supply and sanitation specialist at the World Bank. This will then be followed by the 3rd presentation on positioning of sanitation for increased investment and prioritization for climate finance, which will be given by Ms. Natalie Andre, a sanitation specialist at the Global Green Growth Institute. So without further ado, let me kick off and pass over to Ms. Freya Mills. Over to you, Freya.
Thanks, Anne and Brian, also for the great introduction. Just let the slides shift to our first slide if possible. Great. So I'll share findings from recent research that was conducted by University of Technology Sydney and Universitas Indonesia for UNICEF on climate resilient sanitation in Indonesia. I'll summarise the findings while Ita will present the actions and next steps. Next slide. The research assessed the impacts and response of communities and systems to past climate hazards as a means to inform actions to increase sanitation resilience. Data was collected from households, service providers, and local government in 4 locations in Indonesia, which had diverse climate conditions. We only have time to share very few findings, which are detailed in the published report shown on the left. All climate hazards resulted in households unable to use or access their toilets. This is alarmingly frequent, including 30% of households unable to use their toilet multiple times per week during drought periods. When water was insufficient for using the toilet, 30% of participants reported they would practice open defecation, highlighting that climate hazards pose a risk to achieving and sustaining ODF. We found not only physical impacts, but also households reported facing heightened stress and discomfort meeting defecation needs during all climate hazards. This is more severe for households with lower quality or no sanitation and for those with a family member with a disability. The report also details impacts identified across all stages of the sanitation service chain and highlights that greater attention to climate resilience is needed to achieve safely managed sanitation. Next slide. The findings highlighted that the interactions between water supply, sanitation, and drainage in urban areas are even more apparent during climate hazards. Cases of diarrhea were twice as likely during flooding or extended dry periods, and local governments were concerned that more frequent and severe flooding from rainfall or high sea levels will increase the spreading of disease from contaminated drains. With increasingly scarce water supplies during drought periods, some cities were concerned that the contamination of groundwater from uncontained on-site systems will become a critical issue. With key climate impacts on water supply often receiving greater attention, these various identified interactions provide evidence of the importance of sanitation in efforts to increase water supply resilience. Considering the community, service provider, and local government's capacity to respond, there was initially low awareness of climate impacts on sanitation. However, once these research findings were presented, governments recognised the importance of this issue. In particular, their focus was to achieve ODF. Existing response actions should be built upon. However, all respondents requested guidance and support on really how they could increase sanitation resilience, and also data on local climate projections that they could use to inform planning. As the impacts and responses varied both between and within the cities, this rapid data collection was valuable to provide locally relevant evidence on the potential climate impacts that governments and communities could actually relate to and also take action on. Options to increase resilience were identified and prioritised in workshops with local and national government. And Ita will now summarise some of these and the next steps of this project. To you, Ita.
Thank you, Freya. The research was also succeeded. Next, please. Sorry. Yes, thank you so much. The research was also succeeded in intensifying the dialogue both at national and subnational levels, including the youth and disabled groups to better address their challenges. On advocacy to decision makers, we brought up evidence-based messages on improving synergy as climate change put higher risks to provide access to last mile, including for vulnerable to climate threats, poor household, women, children, and disabled groups. We also conveyed the message that climate change would bring another opportunity, in particular to access climate finance, which could utilize adaptation measures and possibly mitigation and low carbon development of future sanitation investment and infrastructures. Next slide, please. Here are several activities as the follow-up to gradually implement the recommendation generated from the research. There are a range of activities to ensure that sanitation climate resilience is reflected in the planning documents, particularly on SDG 6 roadmap as the government is currently preparing. The activities at national levels are aimed to develop guidance for local governments on providing sanitation climate resilient systems, including developing options on sanitation adaptation and low carbon investment, which could also inform the governments in accessing the climate finance. At subnational level, we supported local governments in integrating the climate resilient in sanitation plan and engaging community groups, including the youth, for raising awareness. These activities encourage the stronger need on expanding collaboration and coordinations from only limit to traditional actor in sanitation development to involving stakeholders in climate change to ensure integrated action to protect surface, environment, and public health. I think that's all from us. Over to Martin. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Ita. Thanks, Freya. Next slide, please. So GRID is the World Bank's new framework for green, resilient and inclusive development, now being applied globally to the bank's very large sustainable development portfolio. I'll briefly describe how the bank's citywide inclusive sanitation initiative aligns with the GRID framework next. Next slide. Sanitation and green go together hand in hand. A lack of safely managed sanitation leads to negative impacts on the immediate environment, on public health, and on the wider environment, including on groundwater and surface and marine water ecosystems. Conversely, safely managed sanitation should lead us to positive impacts on the environment. So citywide inclusive sanitation encourages us to think differently and embrace circular economy and reuse approaches. Next slide. Resilience. There are four main dimensions of shock that can affect the resilience of urban sanitation systems. Public health shocks. We all know that inadequate sanitation causes much of the world's mortality and morbidity. If the next global pandemic is an excreta-related disease, it will ravage cities which aren't providing safely managed sanitation for all. We also need our sanitation systems to have resilience to natural shocks, as referred to by the others, and especially flooding and drought. So well-designed and managed sanitation system can help reduce the negative impact of urban floods. For arid areas, full-service sanitation systems exist which require no water to operate. And the reuse of wastewater effluent should be promoted in drought-prone settings. We also need resilience to migration shocks by providing temporary, semi-permanent and permanent sanitation services to displaced persons, especially those in refugee and IDP camps. And we need resilience to fragility and conflict shocks by providing sanitation services in the context of war and civil unrest. Next, please. Another dimension of CWIS impacting the green and resilience agenda is GHG emissions and carbon footprints. Well-designed and managed urban sanitation systems have key roles to play in minimizing these, but the issues are not fully understood across the different typologies of sanitation services, be these sewers or on-site. We're developing a tool at the bank that systematizes sanitation typologies, allowing us to break down the sources of direct and indirect GHGs along the service chain so we can understand the impacts and better design systems. Most attention to emissions in sanitation has been on centralized wastewater treatment plants, but we need to understand GHG contributions of the whole service chain and for all types of sanitation system. So we need more data and advocacy to make the case for leveraging green and climate funding for sanitation. Next slide, please. Inclusion. CWIS aims to shift the paradigm of urban sanitation to focus on access for all and especially the poor. Inclusive is the I in CWIS and is part of the CWIS guiding principles in which everybody benefits from adequate sanitation service delivery outcomes, with unserved and underserved groups specifically targeted. Next. So development. We've been taking CWIS thinking to World Bank urban sanitation projects for the last few years. Our CWIS TA spans 30 countries covering all regions through which we've been influencing around $5 billion worth of investment so far. The tools and resources we've developed to assist project design and implementation are all on our webpage. And we continue to build relationships with key development partners on CWIS at the global and country levels, including historically with the Gates Foundation and more recently with UNICEF. Next, please. Finally, we've added a J to the alphabet soup, J for jobs. We need to pursue green, resilient and inclusive responses to the COVID pandemic, which create jobs, not only the construction and equipment supply jobs, but also those associated with service delivery itself. We started analyzing the types of direct and indirect jobs that can be created along the sanitation service chain, both for on-site and sewage services, as shown here. And next, in summary, sanitation is and should continue to be at the heart of green, resilient and inclusive development and post-pandemic job creation. Thank you. Over to the next speaker, Natalie.
Sorry, thanks very much, presenters. And sorry to just jump in quickly. I have a request from the translator for the speakers to slow down a little bit. They're having trouble catching all the words. So now you have the dual challenge of meeting 4 minutes and speaking a little bit more slowly. So thanks very much, and over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Anne. So this is Natalie Andre from the Global Green Growth Institute. It's an intergovernmental organization with headquarters in Seoul and with offices in over 30 member countries embedded in host ministries. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of positioning of sanitation for increased investment and prioritization for climate finance, based mainly on our experience of a project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Nepal and Senegal, where we've been aiming to get climate finance for sanitation infrastructure. Next. So we know that there's a finance gap for WASH and in particular for sanitation. A recent CPI report indicates that there's just under 600 billion USD in climate finance, yet only 13 billion, so less than 2%, goes to water and waste, of which sanitation is just a small proportion. So how can sanitation be better positioned to obtain more climate finance? So I'm going to start really with the conclusion, which is we feel that climate arguments need to be established and agreed by global stakeholders and widely disseminated, because the climate financiers have not received the messages in a consolidated form. The next is more at a national level, the inclusion of sanitation in national strategies for climate, which includes the NDCs, but also the NAPs. Next, please. So what are these climate arguments? They've already been briefly described by colleagues earlier. They can be summarized in two categories for climate financiers under mitigation and adaptation, where fecal sludge that's contained or dumped into fields and not treated when in anaerobic conditions produces GHG gases, mainly methane and nitrous oxide. So the climate finance can support infrastructure, namely treatments. When we look at the reductions of the treatments, comparing the baseline scenario where fecal sludge is either just contained or contained and dumped, and then emissions when there's treatments. So there is a target for climate finance, which is often below 50 USD per ton. So the investment compared to the emissions must try and aim for below 50, if possible around 20. And then in terms of adaptation arguments, these are also mentioned by previous speakers, but for sanitation, the main arguments are around the greater temperature and rainfall variability, which oftentimes translates to more frequent flooding and droughts. And then, of course, there's the increasing risk of damage to sanitation infrastructure because of climate change. Next. So I'm just going to very briefly give a concrete example in Nepal where we had climate arguments. So it's estimated that around 1.6 tons of CO2 emissions is just from fecal sludge. And to that respect, Nepal has recently incorporated NDC targets for the treatment of wastewater and fecal sludge in its NDC. And I'm very happy that we have the Joint Secretary from Nepal to speak about this a little later. And if you could go next, just so that the rest of the figure comes up. Yeah, so in order to try and attract climate finance, we had to really identify all the potential emission sources. And this is just an overview of what we looked at and identified the main ones, and using appropriate CDM methodologies, estimated the emissions that would be saved from that. Next. And I'm going to conclude because I'm running out of time, but the adaptation arguments for Nepal are very clear: increased flooding due to glacial melting and also precipitation changes. Thank you. Over.
Thanks very much, Natalie. And thanks to all the speakers for keeping to time and for really excellent and concise presentations. I think we heard good messaging around the need for compelling evidence on climate resilient sanitation to help policymakers think through some of the options and interventions that would be applicable. And this is important across the entire sanitation value chain. I think we also heard a little bit about the need for a paradigm shift to really focus on inclusive sanitation, and we also heard about the need for more cohesive and agreed upon climate arguments to position sanitation within the framework of global financing that's available for sanitation. So thanks very much. And I'd like to now engage some of our participants to ask their questions. I am going to just check the Pathable to see if anything has come in. Juliet, I just want to make sure we don't have anything that's come in at the last minute, because I didn't see anything when we checked earlier. And so perhaps while we're compiling those questions, I'd like to just turn back to our panel now, and just thinking that we have quite a high-level panel that's coming in next to offer their reflections of, of the real, the work of trying to put this in play in countries. I'd like to just give our expert speakers one last opportunity to come in and perhaps give one recommendation to provide a segue into our next component of this session. So perhaps I can start with Freya and Ita. Would either of you like to come in with one sort of final statement that you would sort of like to distill for government in terms of developing and having this compelling evidence to move forward on climate resilient policies in countries? Over to you, Ita and Freya.
Yes, thank you. And I think from both presentations, from the evidences and also what we are doing now, we both think that it is critical to create and present compelling evidences to decision makers on about the ongoing climate impact to the achievement of the SDGs, especially on providing sanitation access to the last mile and most vulnerable groups. While at the same time, we also need to convince them that climate change can create opportunity for them too, in particular to access support and resources related to climate adaptation and mitigations. I think that is come from us, and thank you.
Okay, fantastic. That's fantastic, Ita. That's a great recommendation to make it compelling, both in terms of the evidence, but also the opportunity that exists, when we think about climate resilience in the urban sanitation context. I'd like to pass over to Martin now. Martin, would you like to come in on, a key recommendation you may have for governments in terms of making this inclusive and addressing the paradigm shift that you mentioned in your presentation earlier? Over
Certainly,
to you,
and I would firstly completely agree with what Ita just said and sign underneath that a great recommendation. I would add one other dimension that I didn't mention in the very quick 4-minute overview: the link to other services and other realities within the urban context. So our resilient sanitation has to be clearly aligned with water supply, with volumes, and with consistency of water supplies. It needs to be it needs to be articulated with ground conditions and density, the reality of the urban dynamics, including drainage, solid waste, and access ways. So we need to look at sanitation and resilient sanitation in this context of resilient urban development. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Barton. And the idea of a more integrated approach across services being a very important message. So before, Natalie, I switch over to you and give you the microphone, we do have one question. And Natalie, you're welcome to come in on this, or to make your recommendation to governments in terms of accessing financing and positioning urban sanitation resilience and climate resilience more effectively. But I'd like to mention the question in the event you'd also like to comment on this. So the question is this: has there been a comparative study between the carbon emission and impact of waterborne sewage systems as compared to diesel, petrol-borne fecal sludge moving honeysuckers? So if I understand this correctly, a comparison between the impact of a traditional sewage system as compared to sort of the FSM sort of model. So if you have any inputs on that, Natalie, please feel free, but I'd also welcome inputs from others after Natalie has spoken. So over to you, Natalie.
Sure. So with regards to the study, I think, the tool developed by the World Bank may address different systems, in particular, taking into account the diesel aspect. I can't say. I think there have been numerous studies looking at different systems, but the honeysuckle, I can't say whether it's been done or not. I'd maybe just agree with all colleagues previously on their main messages, and maybe just also ask for financiers and for climate specialists to also join the conversation, as I feel that as water sector people, we've been talking amongst ourselves, and there's a need to bring them in for one to share where we feel the arguments are strong, but also to get their perspective on so that we have the right arguments for climate finance. And I'm seeing this, having been working with the GCF as well on climate finance. I think there's a real need to bring the financiers and the climate specialists on board in this discussion as well. Over.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Much appreciated. The point that we need to start broadening the discussion and bringing others into this discussion of climate resilient sanitation. So I'd like to.
Anne, may I just quickly add to that, because the reference is made to the bank tool. So our tool is precisely doing what that question asked, is looking at the sanitation service chain for sewers, for on-site and FSM, for container-based sanitation, and understanding where the indirect and direct emissions are occurring. And we're now obliged to do that for all of our infrastructure projects, the GHG contributions of every project. But as Brian says in the chat as well, it happens to be in the Zoom chat. Professor Barbara Evans of the University of Leeds has taken a look in Kampala of the contribution of on-site sanitation and FSM to the city of Kampala's GHG emissions, and has found that the transportation with the trucks is minimal compared to the GHGs generated through methane in each of the containment structures at the household level. And in fact, that those containment GHG emissions are equivalent to half of all of the city's GHGs. So and she's made some recommendations about management and scheduled emptying to stop them becoming anaerobic digesters, basically, that emit methane to the environment. So there has been that analysis done, and there are papers available on that as well, which should be looked at.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. We do have 2 more questions that have come in, and I also had a comment you know, I'd like to pass over to Brian Arbogast just to come in quickly on the initial question that we had about the study. So Brian, I'll just hand over to you for a second while we look at these. We'll probably take 2 more questions after this and then shift over to our high-level panel. So over to you, Brian.
Now, are you referring to the study between the carbon emission impacts of the waterborne? So I think Martin actually just spoke to that, the fact that that the GHG emissions from both the containment component and the treatment components, Barbara and her team at Leeds found that they kind of vastly overwhelmed, and it was kind of counterintuitive to her and her team and to all of us that those emissions were much higher than the emissions that would come from either the transport component of a sewer system or the transport component of, you know, of emptying and honeysuckers.
Okay, thanks so much, Brian, for the additional points on that. I'm afraid that we are out of time for the Q&A on this panel, but there will be additional time as we get through the second level of speakers that we have now. So I'd like to move us on, but I do encourage you to keep asking the questions in the chat, and please, speakers, please feel free to respond in chat to some of these, because some good thinking and good comments coming out in the chat room now. So without further ado, I would like to move to our high-level panel discussion. And these are our practitioners, policymakers, government officials that have joined us this morning. And we're really grateful for their presence here this morning. Once again, I'd like to introduce them in sequence, and then I will be giving each of our high-level panel members a chance to give some opening remarks and to also to reflect on what we've just heard in the opening framing session. So first we have Ms. Sartaj Gul, the Honorable Minister of State on Climate Change from Pakistan, who has joined us live this morning, and we're really grateful to her for making the time to be with us this morning and reflect on some of the fantastic work that has been going on in Pakistan. Second, we have Sunil Kumar Das, sir, the Joint Secretary from the Ministry of Water Supply in Nepal. And third, we have the engineer Salim Losindilo, who is the technical manager of the Mwanza Water and Sanitation Authority. So we're really grateful to have such a distinguished panel this morning who can give us some real insights on how this works in practice at country level. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn over to our panelists from Pakistan and ask the Honorable Ms. Sartaj Gul the following question. Ms. Sartaj Gul, how is Pakistan mobilizing political support and enabling environment for climate resilient and safe sanitation in cities? Oh, okay. Sorry, I just realized the Honorable Minister is in an area of low internet connectivity and will be joining us via a video message. So, can I ask Gerald to please play that pre-recorded message?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm thankful to all of the organizers for focusing on the important topic of equitable and resilient urban sanitation services and giving me opportunity to share my experience from Pakistan. Regarding mobilizing political support and enabling environment, I want to inform you that I am an elected member of National Assembly from a rural district called Dera Ghazi Khan, which is very remote and prone to natural disasters like floods, etc. I'm also Minister of State for Climate Change. You can now easily understand as to why this topic is close to my heart. We are very lucky in Pakistan because the political will is being inspired by the visionary leadership of our Prime Minister Imran Khan, and which has mobilized all institutions and all the political leadership at national and provincial level. Our Prime Minister has a vision of investment in human development, and that is why he is so dedicated to invest in green initiatives like 10 billion tree tsunami and Clean Green Pakistan. This is also the reason for our strong working relationship with UNICEF. Our joint program, Clean Green Pakistan Index, is a successful story for creating an enabling environment for the equitable and climate resilient urban sanitation, and I would like to share it briefly. Through Clean Green Pakistan Index for cities, we have developed a healthy competition on 54 key performance indicators, including 10 on urban sanitation among the city government for investing more in a delivery of quality services like sanitation and increasing coverage, while attaining other components of Clean Green Pakistan, for example, waste management, plantation, water, and hygiene. Progress reports on the set of the composite indicators help us in ranking the cities based on which financial and civil award are given to city administration teams and administrators itself, who are civil servants. This has not only attracted the district level resources towards urban sanitation, but also has created a social movement which the support from young volunteers called Clean Green Champions, who are also given awards separately. After success in 20 pilot cities, Clean Green Pakistan Index program is now being expanded to 100 cities in Pakistan. On directions of the Prime Minister Imran Khan, which is demonstration of the highest level of political will and commitment of current government. We are also working with UNICEF to make Clean Green Pakistan indicators climate resilient and child-centered. We believe that instead of vertical programs, which we don't deny are useful, and we will continue to develop to supplement the efforts of local governments in situations like COVID-19. The real change can be brought by the city governments themselves, as using an indigenous and innovative funding mechanism in an equitable manner, and with the support of people, participation, especially youth and women. Equitable and resilient urban sanitation is a dream, and Clean Green Pakistan Index program is helping us realize the dream sooner than later. Thank you.
So we would like to thank the Honorable Minister from Pakistan for having shared that message this morning, despite the difficult circumstances that she found herself in. So thank you very much for that. And I would also like to mention that we do have a senior official from the government of Pakistan, Dr. Saima, who has joined us this morning in the event there are further questions on the excellent work that Pakistan is doing. I'd like to just mention, that the minister has shared some really excellent insights from the Green Pakistan movement, and the focus on local government innovation and competition, which is really the driving force for the initiative. I'd like to now shift over to our distinguished panelist, who again we're very lucky to have joining live this morning. Sunil Kumar Das, sir, the Joint Secretary, Ministry of Water Supply in Nepal. And Mr. Kumar Das, we'd like to ask you the following question. What is the experience of Nepal in preparing for the mobilization of financing for climate resilient urban sanitation? And what actionable advice would you give to other countries? So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anne, and namaskar from Nepal. First of all, for their excellent presentations and the key messages they have given. It is very useful for the sector and also for the Nepal. So thank you very much to all the presenters, and also Natalie presented about the case of Nepal, which we are working together. So thank you, Natalie, for your presentation. So now coming to your question, and in Nepal, as per our constitution, access to safe drinking water and right to live in clean environment is a fundamental right. So this is the point from where we begin in water and sanitation sector. And Nepal has established a clear targets in the waste sector. For example, we have targets under national targets under sector development, sustainable development goal, and we have national 15th development plan. So we have clear targets, and I'm very happy to share, and you may know that Nepal was declared as open defecation country in September 2019. That was a crucial milestone for us, and we achieved it together with the leadership of our government and working together with the development partners, NGOs, INGOs, and we have a great political support in this whole process. So under this 15th development targets, we have said that this attainment of ODF will be sustainable. It will continue, and we will move towards total sanitation. We have national indicators for total sanitation, and likewise in the wastewater and fecal sludge management, we have also national targets that within 15th development plan, 20% of the generated wastewater will be treated. So actually setting our national targets is the driving force to move ahead. That is what we have experienced, and having a national level master plan which clearly defines the roles and responsibility of all stakeholders and the institutional arrangement from the center to the lowest administrative level. So those are the institutional arrangements created within the country. Next important thing I would like to share is that establishing link between climate change. Nepal is most vulnerable country to the effect of climate change. We have 3 ecological regions within a space of 250 kilometers. So it is really challenging. So, and waste sector is the one of the sector that is hit hardest due to effects of climate change. So it is very important for us to understand the linkage between the climate change and the sanitation. Actually, every year country is suffering from flood, landslide. So it is important to establish a link, and we are starting to collect data to just to get sufficient evidences. So that is next point. And another important point I would like to mention is that this integration of sanitation into Nepal's enhanced nationally determined contribution, about which Natalie presented. So we are quantifying the activity and the targets. We have policy targets, and we are working together with the Ministry of Forest and Environment. And so inclusion of sanitation in national strategy for climate has been done in our country, and we need more financing in the sector. So we are this climate financing to support this initiative is also important, and accordingly we applied for the nationally determined contributions. So with the integration of sanitation into our enhanced NDC, we are now in the better position to seek additional climate finances to support our sanitation goals, and at the same time to ensure that our sanitation infrastructure is climate resilient. So now recommending to other countries our related to our learning. So working together with the Ministry of Environment and stakeholder is very much important, and understanding the sanitation sector through climate change agenda is equally important. Working through the sanitation service chains is very important, especially considering this end-use, reuse, and reuse. So those are the some of the experiences I would like to share from Nepal. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar Das. That's very, very excellent points. And Nepal is always trailblazing, initially with reaching elimination of open defecation nationally, and now inclusion of climate change in your NDC is truly remarkable. I think you've raised some great points about the need for a strong M&E system and indicators that underline the sanitation system, and that providing a platform for linking to climate resilience. I think this is really inspiring, and I'm sure we'll have more questions for you. But first, I'd like to hand over the floor to the engineer, Salim Lusindilo from the Mwanza Water and Sanitation Authority. And Salim, I would like to request that you keep your comments to under 5 minutes, because we're quite short on time now and nearing the end of the session. I'd like to make sure that we all have chance for another round of questions. So over to you, Mr. Lusindilo.
Okay, thank you. In Mwanza, actually, it's the city within Tanzania, and we have about the population of 1 million people, and the area is actually covered with sewerage service with about 20%, and as you see, about 80% are not served. And it is unplanned settlement, and actually the nature of the area or the city is the hilly city. We have a rock hilly city. So there is a need of different intervention on the both sewerage and the sanitation issue, because this is a home of Lake Victoria. And our intention actually is to protect the pollution of the lake to protect the health of the lake. And through there is an ongoing project which is doing well, because we have a big project, LVWASA, that is Lake Victoria Water and Sanitation Project. And we come out with a proposal of saving the hill area of the city. That is 80% of the city, which have no access to sanitation. So we come out with a new technology of saving this hill area, and it is simply called Simplified Sewerage System. On this area, actually, we say simplified because we have to compromise with some of the standard, because the area is a hill and it is difficult to save it. And actually, depending on the nature of the city, it is very difficult actually to access for sewerage network as a conventional sewer. And on top of that, there is an occurrence during the heavy rain. People can flush directly from the hill to the stormwater drainage, and actually it endanger the health of Lake Victoria. We come out with this as a pilot, and we do this project to 3 areas of Mwanza, saving about 200 households, and it is doing well. And through that project, we after piloting project, we do the upscaling of the project, and we go to the 7 different areas on the city, and we manage actually to connect them. But still, the city need a lot of intervention concerning with sanitation, because this it is affect the Lake Victoria, health of Lake Victoria, as well as even the climate change of the lake. So we did this project. I feel actually to share the slide, but if we can look on the slide, if I will share you with the slide, maybe I will share after this meeting, you will see how the situation is. And our intervention actually is to protect Lake Victoria, as I said. And through this project, we anticipate maybe to connect about 1,500 connection. That is a household to be served. As you see, it's still a small scale, because we have a population of 1 million, and only 20% have access to the conventional sewerage. That's why we come with this different sanitation, technology, and innovation, by making sure that we have to save the whole hill area of the city. Apart from that, we come out also with
sorry, engineer.
Hello?
Sorry, engineer, you have to wrap
Hello?
up, please. Can you wrap up, please? 1 more minute. Wrap up, please. Thank you.
Okay. So that is a very snapshot on the situation of the Mwanza city, but still we need a lot of intervention on sanitation, and as well as the issue of climatic change, and how we can manage the issue of climatic change, because it is the home of Lake Victoria, health of Lake Victoria. Thank you for the time being. That's what I can say, because we have a very short time to explain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Mr. Lucindo. That was fantastic, and really great insight into some of the challenges that you're facing of hard to reach communities, and how you're trying to overcome that. So I think we've heard a good reflection, from policy angle, from practitioner level, and implementation. And I think it's been a really diverse and engaging discussion, giving us a lot of different perspectives. We don't have any further comments or questions for our panelists, but if you do, if they come in late, please feel free to put them in Passable. But I think in the interest of time, we have 5 minutes remaining, and to try and pull this all together into a key set of messages that we can all take away from this very rich session, I'm going to to hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Graham Alabaster, who is currently the acting head of the UNHCR office, UN Habitat office in Geneva. And yeah, I just want to thank all the panelists one more time for joining us this morning, and to hand over to Graham to bring us to closure on this session. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm delighted to be with you all this morning. Aside from being the chief of the Geneva Office of Habitat, I'm of course a long-time sanitation fan and worker in this sector for all of my career. It's been a very interesting discussion this morning, and we've heard lots of good ideas and proposals. So I'm going to just go through some of the recommendations I've taken away and then talk a little bit about what we should do next to make sure this doesn't get dropped and we carry on. The first point, and this is something that I think is really, really important. And one of the presenters who mentioned it, Natalie, is that we're very good at speaking to one another, but we're not very good to speaking to other people outside. So the key people that we also need to get this message out to, as Natalie said, are the financiers, the climate change specialists, and I would add to that, and this was added by Martin to a certain extent, the urban development community, because without reaching out to these other groups, our voice will not be heard, we will not get the attention. So I think we have to do that, and in order to do that, we have to prepare our arguments and our evidence very well. We heard from this morning that there were many opportunities to document and quantify lots of the releases, both for mitigation and for mitigation and alleviation. But this is, for us, this is really very important. In terms of looking at who the target audience are and what we have to do, of course, as usual, it's the poorest who are left behind, and we mustn't forget that they are the principal focus of a lot of what we want to do. But on the other hand, we also have to balance that in the more developed economies, which have sanitation systems which are more advanced, we also need to understand from richer sectors of the community the contributions they're making and how these can be affected. And I mean, really, this is where the the citywide sanitation comes in, and the idea of grid from Martin is that, in this urban setting, we have to look at green, resilient, and inclusive development to include all sectors. And when we talk about this, we don't just mean the sanitation sector. We have to look at water, drainage, solid waste management, and a lot of the work that we've been doing on non-domestic wastewater, industrial waste. That was mentioned in the chat, and you'd be delighted to know that only 14 countries in the world reported about their discharges of industrial waste in a recent work that we've been doing with WHO. So we have a long way to go to collect this evidence and data. So what do we have to do? We have to look at this data. We have to get in more detail. We have to take this data, and then we have to look at producing practical guidance. That was mentioned by our colleagues from UNICEF, but there's a huge need to develop these practical guidance tools, both for mitigation and adaptation, that we can understand and quantify and share with the wider community. And these tools, again, don't have to be just written for the sanitation community. They have to be written for the broader community to reach out to the urban development specialists, climate finance specialists, and of course, the financiers. Talking about finance, isn't it tragic that although only a small amount of money in the climate finance is going to WASH, but a tiny, ridiculously small amount of 2%, as Natalie said, is actually going to sanitation. How absolutely tragic. We have to do something about that. And of course, the big challenge about the finance is getting it down to the local level. We heard from Engineer Salim in Tanzania about how they're, pioneering new approaches, both soft and hardware, to deliver on sustainable sanitation services. But I'd like to ask how much of that money from the national governments is getting down to the local level to actually help authorities and utilities like Wanza to do this. At the end of the day, the answer is not going to be just about looking at national government-led initiatives. It has to come also from the local level. So very important that we see how we can bolster up that domestic finance, and of course, most importantly, how at the local level. Sanitation, most often, along with solid waste management and drainage, is a responsibility of local authorities in most cases. And this is why CWIS is such an important concept to embrace, and that we all need to support that. I think really, I'm not going to go into too much more other than to say what do we need to do next. And I would invite the conveners of this session and all of those of you who are interested to work together on this partnership. We've got some concrete ideas about what we want to do. We know we want to address the, if you like, the governance policies and systems going beyond 6.2 and 6.3.1, incorporating SDG 11 for cities and financial to get this more holistic approach to what we want to do. We want to support, governments to get in their NDCs and NAPs. We must include this component because it's very highly significant. I haven't got much more to say apart from I think this is a huge area of work to say invite all of the partners here present. And it only leaves me to say on behalf of all the conveners from Brian from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Natalie from the Global Green Growth Institute, Martin from the World Bank, Freya from the University of Technology of Sydney, my colleagues, great colleagues in UNICEF, Anne and Bissy, and of course from myself and my colleague Piriotiano, the lead for WASH in UN Habitat, to thank you all for joining this session, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you in the future to advance this incredibly important part of the climate change agenda. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye to everybody.